All right. So it has been an amazing weekend for the local UCC church. We have with us today the Reverend Rachel Pryor, the conference minister for Southern California and Nevada, who's with us today. And this weekend was her installation formally. She's been here almost a year this summer, and I cannot say enough superlatives about Reverend Pryor. She is so good for Southern California Nevada Conference. Everything that she is doing for our local churches, for Claremont UCC, we are so blessed to have her. So this is a great opportunity for our local church here in Claremont to understand we're part of this much greater network trying its best to work together to push forward on issues of social justice, of the survival of the church, of institutions that protect these core values of inclusivity and justice. And so we're so grateful to have you here with us today and in our conference for the long term. And I can't emphasize enough how blessed we are in this moment right now to have with us the Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson, the General Minister and President of the United Church of Christ. For her to be here, devoting time with us to answer questions and to talk about the life of the church is beyond amazing. So I'm glad some of our confirmation students are here with us. There's no better way to talk about your faith today than with the president of our denomination. And so the Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson, 14 years she's been serving in the national setting. 2 years as our Minister of Racial Justice, then 8 years as our Minister of Ecumenical and Interfaith Relations, and then she was elected as Associate General Minister of Wider Church Ministries, Executive Director of Global Ministries, so UCC does work across the world, and now as our President and General Minister. And so you are a theologian and a writer, and this weekend I've discovered a poet. You've shared some of your poems with us that have been beautiful. And so let's give a warm welcome to the Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson.
Good morning. Good morning. I think this was more suited for my height. It is good to be present. Good to see you all this morning. And I am a poet, among other things. I do have a book of poems that I've published over the years, and another that I'm actually gonna publish if I ever get like my spare time back. It's a lot in terms of showing up and being present, but I believe that as the General Minister and President, like being at my desk is not where the work happens, right? It happens when I show up in these spaces and I'm able to be present. I'm gonna pull this a little bit closer also. And I'm able to be present to hear from you and to be in conversation. And so I was asked, what did I want to talk about this morning? And I was like, well, I don't really want to talk about anything. I want to hear what you have to say, because that helps me to maybe get a little bit on the finger of the pulse of the life of the church. But I think if there was like, there are a couple of things that I like to talk about. I like to talk about spirituality in the church because I believe that what we do in the life of the church is actually undergirded by our spirituality. And that if there's a topic that we don't talk about enough, it's spirituality and how that impacts our lives and what that means for the church in a lot of ways. So I like to talk about that. And then I also like to talk about poetry as a spiritual practice. And I discovered over the years, my own writing, by the way, this is just time for you to like get your questions together. Okay. I have a lot of material. So I discovered over the years that my writing was important to me, but it was something that I always took for granted. I write most mornings. Now I feel like I'm just too busy. And what I've noticed in my own life is that the things that I release when I'm busy are actually the things that are most important to my existence. Right? So when I start to think about, my time and what am I missing, it's usually the things that I've released because I'm just too busy, but then I start to feel the some of the drain that comes from releasing some of those things inadvertently. So there was a once upon a time when I would wake up at like 5 o'clock in the mornings. I could meditate, do my prayers, free write, then get ready for the office and be in the office. Right now, I feel like I get up at 5 o'clock just so I could be in the office by 6. You know what I mean? To beat the traffic, be there ahead of folks. Or I'm up at 3 because I need to be at the airport by 5. And, so I'm meditating on the plane, right? Which is not really the same thing. So, and I'm not writing enough because, hey, this weekend, there's a sermon, there was a charge, there was another thing Friday night, but the creative writing that probably more nurtures is something that requires a different kind of time and quiet and all those kinds of things. So I think that it's important for us to create the time that we need, because it's not just going to pop up and say, hey, here's that half an hour that you need for today's prayer time. You have to kind of schedule that stuff. And so I do have that on my calendar. It says morning time, and it's on there like every single day on my schedule. And inside of it is like, write, meditate, pray, right? So that it's my reminder at some point during the day that I need to get that done in order to keep myself going. And that depends on what time zone I'm in, because sometimes it pops up at like midnight, sometimes it pops up at 3 a.m., depending on where I am. So anyway, so your questions. Now, let me tell you what the parameters are for questions this morning. You can really ask me anything. If there's a question that I cannot answer, I will tell you that I can't answer that question. If there's a question that I won't answer, I will tell you that I won't answer that question. But feel free to ask your questions. And a part of my role this morning is to repeat your questions into the microphone so that those who are online can also hear. All right. There we go. We have a taker.
I'm always shy. I'm Mel Boynton.
Mel Boynton.
And a longtime member of this congregation, and we're so glad you're here. I encourage you to get good sleep. Sleep is so important. But I'm president of the United Nations Association locally, and I think our church and our country are challenged, like the world, by inequality and the climate crisis and inequality. I just like your thoughts on growing inequality. We got the richest man in the world tearing our government apart, and the climate crisis is not going to go away no matter how much the politicians talk.
All right, so the question is really about the climate crisis and I would say the current situation, and you did mention the United Nations, so I'll talk about that too. I do believe that the United States has been gradually moving into really a very isolated way of living. The isolationism, American exceptionalism, I think have been on display for a really long time. And I think one of the places where that has historically manifested is in the United States relationship to the United Nations, right? So I want to talk about that. And so I think that the United States has consistently undermined the multilateral space, particularly when it comes to multiple conventions. And in that way, it has exempted itself from really, I think, some of the human rights frameworks that are actually necessary for us in the living of these days in particular, right? So most people in the United States don't really understand how the United Nations works. They don't understand things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They don't understand a lot of that kind of stuff. They don't understand why it's important for the United States to be a part of things like COP or other places where the global community is really looking at things like climate, right? So I think in this moment, our crisis is not only constitutional, right? Our crisis is not only about our civil rights. Our crisis is also the fact that we have no recourse because we have been isolated from the mechanisms that could actually provide additional checks and balances to what's happening in the United States, right? So we don't use those mechanisms right now. This is more than you asked, by the way. Right now, we are in the process. This is a year for universal periodic review for the United States. And the United Church of Christ is providing a response along with the World Council of Churches to that periodic review. And what we're citing are some of the human rights violations, which actually were mentioned in the last periodic review, but were not addressed, and also pointing to some of what's happening now. So I do think that the climate crisis actually requires a global response. And among the many things with this government is one, the denial of the climate crisis, right? The ongoing challenges around many things, even the use of land, permits that are being given, the cut in the forestry department, all of those things I think are leading into, I think, some additional challenges that are yet identified. So I think that there is what we're experiencing in these days, like the immediate, but I do think that there are some long-term effects that have not yet been calculated in terms of what we're seeing in these early days of this administration. You're welcome. Yes.
What are your thoughts on how the church should respond to the rise of Christian nationalism and its foundation in white supremacy? And that is on the rise in this country.
So the question is, how do I think the church should be responding to the rise of white supremacy, of Christian nationalism and its foundation in white supremacy? I think we've missed the boat. And I would say that because this has been happening for a long time. And one of our primary challenges, which is, there are lots of things that I've been saying for years, but nobody listens to me, so, one of our biggest challenges is that we did not pay attention to refuting the historic ways in which Christianity has been manipulated, right? So, we changed our laws, right, to some extent. So you could look at the Civil Rights Act, those kinds of things, right? But every turn of crisis has been somehow underpinned by theology, right? So we could go back through history, right? And look at Jim Crow, which was underpinned by theology. We could look at apartheid, which was underpinned by theology, Christian theology, right? We could look at the historic enslavement of African peoples, the decimation of indigenous communities. We have relied on people of color and oppressed peoples to do the theology that has been necessary to push back at white supremacist theology, right? Every one of those was a white supremacist theology. So we haven't done the work, right? And when I say we haven't done the work, I'm saying white folks haven't done the work. We could point to people like Karl Barth, and others who have done that kind of work. But I think at the point where you don't say, and the you here is the global we, right? we don't say that this particular thing was historically wrong. What's happening right now with white Christian nationalism is actually just a renaming of those same spaces, right? It's the same thing. It's decrying people's human rights and dignity. You're focusing on negating people. You're focusing on saying that one group of people is better than the other, and you're doing it theologically. Let me also say that we need to stop calling that stuff Christian, right? So it needs some other kind of name, right? Because when we call it Christian, it says that we are owning it as a part of what we understand as our faith tradition. And I don't think it is, right? So I think that there's certainly the use of God talk, right? Which would make it theology, right? What would make it Christian? It's absent of God's love, and I believe that God's love is necessary for something to be Christian, right? It's also extremely fundamentalist in its scope, right? And so I think that there's also a kind of radicalization, right, that's present in it. So I do believe that we need to talk, we need to be clear. We need to stop giving it, I think, some of the energy that it's been given. And I think that we need to begin to talk about the distinction between being patriotic and being a nationalist, right? I got an email the other day, I got all kinds of emails and letters and stuff, right? And in November of last year, along with the conference ministers following the election, we had written a letter around Christian unity, right? It was a pastoral letter that was addressed to our churches. And it was really talking about bridging the post-election divide. So that was in November. Last week, I get a letter. And the folks in this letter who are UCC basically said, you are calling us, whatever they said I was calling them. I don't even know them, right? I don't know who they are. But what they said was, we support, we believe that the problem in this country is not white Christian nationalism, that it's a lot of other things, right? And these are the things you said about us. We are patriotic Americans and we are Christian, right? Now, patriotic Christians are different than Christian nationalists. Nationalism is an ideology. Patriotism is love of country, okay? Basic. So how do we talk about that so that folks who understand themselves to be patriotic can hear that's not what we're talking about, right? Many of us in here are patriotic, but we would not identify ourselves as nationalists, right? Let me also say that in the framing of white Christian nationalism in this country, there has to be a framing of the global context of Christian nationalism. It's not just here. It's happening in other countries, Germany, in parts of Europe. This thing is springing up, right? We also need to talk about nationalism and this kind of religious fervor in context of what's going on in other faith traditions, right? So we see it in Islamic tradition, in Buddhist tradition, right? So this is some of what we're seeing in places like Myanmar, where governments in India too, with the Hindi government, we have to be able to call out authoritarianism, right? So again, kind of going back to our isolation and our American exceptionalism, right? Whatever we do, we seem to feel that we are the only ones doing it, and we're going to do it the greatest and the best, even when it's oppression. So we need to be able to do that contextual framing, right? And to be able to also hear from our partners in other countries who have actually been dealing with some of these issues far longer than we have, and who have been living through these kinds of conditions and continue to provide effective response. Yes.
Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for sharing thoughts. What is our denomination doing itself, and how is it working with other denominations to deal with this set of issues? I've seen the powerful impacts of when the religious community gets together to deal with particular tangible sort of challenges. Like when I live in the Washington, D.C. area and supporting doing something about affordable housing. This is a more trying sort of topic to deal with in some ways, but I'm wondering what we're doing as a denomination, how we're working with others, and what we can do here at CUCC to aid and abet what you're doing.
Thank you. So over the weekend, on Friday, Mike Newroth was with the clergy, and Mike Newroth is the director for our Washington, D.C. office, which is advocacy and public policy. And I would say, I would start there in terms of what is the denomination doing. We continue to maintain and to have a Washington, D.C. presence. We have about 6 staff people in Washington, D.C. who are working collaboratively in the interfaith community. So this is not just ecumenical, but also interfaith. They're a part of the Washington Interfaith Staff Community, WISC, and they continue to work across the aisles, if you will, on a lot of these issues that we're talking about, right? White Christian nationalism is one of many things that shows up. It's like the disease, and then there's the symptoms, right? And some of the symptoms are what we're seeing. So they continue to do that. On the United Church of Christ webpage, there's they've started a page that's called the First 100 Days, right? And when you go to the UCC website and you visit there, what you're seeing is really what has been the church's response in this first 100 days of the administration. We decided that we're going to do the first 100, and then after that, we'll see what direction we take that in. We continue to be responsive, both in terms of the ecumenical response and out of Washington, D.C. We continue to do sign-on letters that are coming out of a number of places. We continue to do the coalition building that is necessary for this time, because we can't do this work alone, right? So the ecumenical spaces are important, National Council of Churches and other spaces. So there's a lot going on. I think a part of the challenge, right, is that as of Wednesday, there were 104 executive orders, right, addressing multiple issues, right? And at that point, we were at like 60 something days, right? Friday, we were at 67 days, right? With 104 executive orders, each one addressing different issues, right? How do we speak to 104 executive orders with different issues in only 67 days, right? So there has to be choice, and there has to be a strategy that says that we cannot speak to everything. So there are times when we're going to sign on, there are times when we're going to support others in what they're doing, because we cannot do everything. If there's anything that I would say to our churches in terms of how you respond, I would say, first of all, educate yourself, right? Most of us are not reading. I started reading them in my spare time. We're not reading the executive orders, right? We're getting the information on the news, right? There's the government, the White House, actually, the White House website keeps a list of all the executive orders that has been signed. And there's also a government registry page that keeps track of all of these. And there are also other groups that are tracking them. Most of them are not long, right? They're not, think about the person who's writing and signing them. They're not lengthy in scope, and they're not entrenched in technical language, right? If you have an interest and you simply scroll, each one of them is titled in such a way that if you read the title, you actually have a sense of what's inside of it, right? What I've found, if you read even 5 of them, what you start discovering is that the content of some of these are not consistent with what's being executed. That's the challenge. So you read what it says, and then you look at what's being implemented, right? And that's where it becomes very scary and highly problematic, right? So the DEI executive order says that programs that focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion are immoral and illegal. That's what it says in the document, right? Illegal needs a standard, right? So does immoral. But what you're saying is the focus on diversity. So you look around this room, right? And the ways in which you choose to be inclusive, that somebody has says that that's illegal.
Just to follow up on that, does what we're doing meet the need of the moment? Because I feel like Mel says, they're taking a wrecking ball to the federal government, and we're still with our petitions and sign-on letters.
Well, it's a start. I was in Washington, D.C. on Ash Wednesday. I spoke 3 times, 3 different events. People are out there doing the work, right? And it's important for us to do the work. So yes, the petitions and the sign-on letters, your communication with your Congress people, all of that becomes important. Your vote is important. Your presence is important. Everything that is strategic that could possibly impact is of value in this moment, right? The unfortunate part about it is that this is all unfolding, right? And we're constantly responsive and reactive because you don't know, right? What's gonna happen from one day to the next, right? The U.S. Institute of Peace is, they took a wrecking ball to that, right? A part of my question is, where's all this money going, right? So we're supposed to be saving all this money, but where's it going, right? In the meantime, we're paying to house people in foreign countries, right? All these people that we keep deporting are actually being housed someplace. The ones that are being detained, we're paying for that, right? So I think that we need to pay attention. And I think also there's really no one way to go at this, right? So different communities are doing different things. And so I think it's about knowing what's happening in your community, figuring out, and when I say knowing what's happening in your community, right? So I'm in my sermon for this morning, one of the things I talk about is what's happening in Washington, D.C., right? And the issues in Washington, D.C. are such that people are losing their jobs, right? The unemployment is increasing. It's impacting in communities. People are selling their houses and leaving because they don't have jobs, et cetera, the anxiety. So it's really, so the one side of it is the forward-facing piece, right? Which is what shows up in our news. The back end of that is the things that we don't know, and the suffering of the people that we also need to attend to, and the violation of people's rights that also has to be attended to. So I would say there's no cookie cutter method here, right? And I don't think that it's business as usual. I think that we really need to be more vigilant, and I think strategy is starting to come about. I don't think anybody expected that the first 100 was going to be like this.
It seems to me that we really need to challenge definitions.
Mhm.
We need to support DEI, not run away from it.
That's right.
We need to define Christianity, because they're defining Christianity as too much empathy, that we need to get away from empathy. Empathy is ruining our country, et cetera. We need to challenge the definitions.
So the comment is that we need to challenge definitions, and I would agree with you, right? I think that we've taken a lot for granted progressively, particularly in progressive and liberal political spaces, right? And I think that we have missed, right? How we educate and how we talk about things, because we assume that people are all on the same page. Right. And it's not true, right? So I've had conversations with people during the election cycle, right? And this question about, all these people who are pouring across our borders illegally, right? And I was like, I've been on the borders, like there's no like gate. Like there's, like there's no place where, people are just coming in illegally, right? That doesn't happen, right? What you need to do is watch How to Catch a Smuggler, right? Because what you realize is that people forge documents, people do all kinds of things, right? To get out of their countries and to get into other spaces, right? So those kinds of things, right? When we hear them, we go, oh my God, that's just ridiculous. And we brush it off, right? There are other people who hear it and believe it to be true, and there's no contrary information to say this is not true, this is what is true, because we sometimes are dismissive in saying, that's just stupid. Nobody's going to believe that. So I don't think it's just about definitions. I think it's about how we talk about things that we disagree with, right? Or don't talk about things that we disagree with, because that has, I think, problematized also. If you're on in any kind of social media space, you see the ways that people are talking about each other, and it does not provide the opportunity to provide any other kind of information, right? So I think that how we talk about things has to change. The values that we place on things has to change, and some of the ways in which we talk even about our faith needs to change, because a lot of us don't talk about our faith. We talk about justice, but justice is a byproduct of our faith, right? Those two things are not independent, right? So we do this as a product, as a part of our faith. And I do believe that this whole thing about, this kind of, I want to call it like a rabid Christianity, right? That's violent and even, and has no love to it, right? That's problematic, right? When people talk about, well, immigration or, well, any of the other issues, what are we saying as to why we believe that these are issues of justice? Because they're not talking justice. They're just saying this is about our Christian faith. There's no text, there's no chapter, there's no verse, right? It may not even be in the book, but they're pretty solid in what they're saying. Oh, and they're also consistent, because we're busy fighting amongst each other. Yes.
Do you have any personal experience bringing someone over from the white supremacy view to more empathetic, kind inclusive view?
Okay, say that again.
Do you have any experience on like a personal individual basis, bringing someone from the white supremacist view to what we believe Christianity really is, or just generally a more empathetic view?
No, that is not my ministry. And I think it's more than a conversion experience, right? I think it's about time. So I've never had the experience, but that is not to say that something that I've said hasn't caused somebody to change their minds. And that's what I mean, right? That it's hard to say, like, how and when and why people change their minds about, the direction that they're going. I also, I think that it's more than, how do we bring people, kind of over. I think it's probably more about, can we hear the why in a way that allows us to have the conversations that are necessary? Because most of us are not even listening to, we don't want to hear it, right? It's putrid. We don't necessarily want to hear it, but I think that there's a why. And there has to be like a different kind of conversation to even get to this other place in this discourse. Yes, and did you have your hand up? Okay, yes.
Yeah, looking at the demographics of this room, we've all seen horrible times in the past, that these times seem to be exceptionally horrible because we feel somewhat helpless. From your perspective, while hope isn't a strategy, can you point to areas where you see things as hopeful and how we can build it?
Yeah. The question is about finding hope in this moment. Like, where do I see hope, right? Without like stepping too much into my sermon for today, I would say that one, there are communities of resistance, right? And I think that there's more and more of that's becoming public, right? There are judges that are saying this is wrong, right? And unfortunately, the punitive nature of this government is coming back at them, but there are people who are willing to stand up in this moment. I would also say that I look back over history, and when has there not been a time, right, where some group or another was being publicly targeted, right? Deportations are not new in this country. Every president has deported people from this country, just not in this way, right? Some of these folks have actually had due process and they were deported, right? Picking people up off the street and locking them up, right? That kind of stuff has not been seen before, but it depends on who you talk to, because people of color would say it's been this way for a long time. We went through years of George Floyd's killing, there was a whole list of Black and brown folks who were shot by police, extrajudicial killings, etc. There were protests in the street and so forth and so on, right? That was a particular season in this country, right? There has been a time when there were lynchings in this country. I would say that we, the people, right, in every age, have had the opportunity to provide resistance, right? And to speak up for people's civil and human rights. And I believe that this is such a time. And so if there's a place where I find hope, it's in our ability to get up and to say we're going to be a part of the resistance and that we're not going to take this lying down and that we're going to use whatever means are necessary, right, to get through this moment. And that means that we need to be able to find ways to support each other, right? So we can't be dismissive. We ought not to be neglecting the ways that we nurture and sustain ourselves spiritually. We ought not to be neglecting the ways that we gather and the ways that we support each other in community. Because I would say if we continue on this trend where we're so isolated as we are, it's going to continue to problematize our resistance, right? Because people have removed themselves somewhat from public spaces, right? We're not having the same kinds of conversations. I said this on Friday night and I'll say it again. I get tired of people texting me saying, you know, can you talk? Like, can't we just pick up the phone and have a conversation anymore, right? We text to figure out if we want to talk. We are communicating in ways that are not personal, right? We're not getting to know each other. We're not gathering in the same kinds of ways, right? Zoom is really is a temporary strategy, right? It does not create some of what we need. It is a way that we can get by, but we really need to be strategizing differently in terms of how we're able to support each other and build the coalitions that are necessary. And that's the other thing is I think that people are coming together and they're looking at the ways that they can do this work together. And as people of faith, we need to find ourselves into these spaces to be able to talk about how we nurture and sustain each other through this, which is going to include providing services for people who are being denied those.
All right, yes, please. Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Thompson. Wow, that was incredible. This is what we have always done as people of faith from the very beginning of the Christian movement, has been an act of resistance of the ways of the empire to care for those in our community who are in need, and we will continue to do that. Thank you so, so much. Can't wait to hear Reverend Dr. Thompson's sermon in worship, and so we will conclude this time and go into the sanctuary. Thanks for being here, everyone.